Hey, what's up, folks, and welcome back to the Green Torch podcast, where we showcase and discuss real-life, on-the-ground stories of cross-border environmental cooperation in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm your host, Josiah Shaver, and I'm excited again today to just dive back into the conversation we started. This is part B of a two-part conversation where I have a really in-depth interview, and super excited for you to listen to the next section here. I wanted to review really quick Soumya's bio, because it's pretty good in case you forgot or in case you didn't catch it last time. So here's her bio. Dr. Soumya Balasubramanya is a senior researcher in environment and development economics at the International Water Management Institute, or CGIAR. She uses economic methods to address environmental and development challenges in Asia and Africa. Her expertise in program evaluation and non-market valuation is based on 10 years of field research in developing countries. Her work has been used by international aid agencies and financial organizations to inform investments and programs, and by governments in developing countries to design policy. Super cool background. Okay, I'm just gonna press play on the next section of this interview, and I'll catch you on the flip side.
Yeah, so I want to transition a bit and ask you about your other experiences in Tunisia and Ethiopia. Honestly, I have no idea what your experience is. This can be completely brand new to me, but I don't know, what's your experience and how does it relate to environment, agriculture? I'll just let you start.
Sure. So let's talk about Tunisia first, right? So Tunisia, in a sense, some of the problems are very similar to, when you talk about agricultural water. The problems are quite similar to the Middle East, particularly Jordan. The difference, though, is most farms in Tunisia that use groundwater are usually very small farms. So it's the problem of, again, how do you manage natural resources against a background of poverty? And that's what makes Tunisia different from the highlands in Jordan. Because the highlands in Jordan are owned by people who are not poor. They employ people who may be poor, but they're not owned by people who are poor, right? Yeah.
And actually, can we just talk about where Tunisia is? Some people are going to know exactly where this is, but since this is a podcast, we can't do exactly a visual for folks, but maybe we can talk through it. So we have Israel, Palestine, we have Egypt and North Africa. Can you kind of explain where it is?
It's again, Tunisia is Northern Africa, sort of, small little country on the Mediterranean coast. Well, it was one of those key places where there was sort of related, when the Arab Spring sort of happened. Tunisia was one of those countries where things got charged up as well. Again, as a consequence of harsh realities of poverty, of food insecurity, of livelihoods, against a backdrop of governments which were, perceived to be not delivering on services and delivering standards of life that people felt that they were, obliged to have. So it's a small country bang on the Mediterranean coast. And there is, again, there's quite a lot of agriculture there. It's fruit trees, vegetables. There's quite a bit of livestock in Tunisia because these are smallholder farms. These are, farms are small and they're owned by small, small tracts of land are owned by families essentially. And there's many of them. It used to be a French colony. Yeah, there you go. That should be the name. It used to be a French colony. So, or a French protectorate or something like that. I don't know, whatever the word is. So, yeah. So that's Tunisia. So there, what we were doing was, again, we were looking at trying to understand what can be done in order to better manage natural resources, increase incomes from these farms while also managing water better. And so part of the solution there is thinking about how do you just increase and improve the kinds of inputs that are being used, right? And improve both the application of traditional practices as well as modern practices that put together can manage these agricultural systems a bit better, including thinking about traditional ways of recharging groundwater resources, which have been practiced in Tunisia in the past, but which have sort of kind of fallen by the wayside for a number of reasons. And how can we think about bringing some of these practices back? How can communities get better involved in the management of these resources? Because unlike the uplands of Jordan, where farms have their own wells, in Tunisia it's a bit more complex. Many small farms have their own wells, but there's also sharing of wells and groundwater, and so multiple farms might get irrigated by the same well. And overlaying that is often surface water resources, which also supply water to multiple farms at the same time. So any management structure in Tunisia has to account for the different manner in which people interact with the resource, right? So communities have to come in and have to get engaged for these resources to be better managed. There's a lot of well installation in Tunisia, which is not regulated. Because again, people need water resources. They're often not able to access it, so people go ahead and install their own well. But it's not a licensed well; it's an unlicensed well. And so and better management of groundwater is going to need the cooperation of all kinds of farmers, irrespective of whether they own and use licensed or unlicensed wells. And so we were thinking about how do we bring these communities into the fold? What are the incentives that could be provided in order to bring them to the table to cooperate, with water management, water recharge, those kinds of activities. That's what we were looking at in Tunisia.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And this was this your previous organization, or is this the World Bank?
All of this is with the previous my previous. Yes. So we were thinking about, what do we do in order to kind of, what do we do in order to incentivize farmers to do that? What might be some ways in which we bring communities together? Could we be offering, for example, better marketing services of products? Because that's often a problem. You produce these products, and then who do I sell them to in order to get a good price and make a good income? Might that be a good way to bring farmers to the, to cooperate with you and say, hey, as a state, as a government, we're able to offer these resources to you. Please cooperate with us so that we can better manage these groundwater resources that you are also dependent on. So how do we sort of think about these opportunities where we can have essentially conditional cooperation, right? So that's kind of what we were looking at there. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So would you call this type of cooperation cross-boundary environmental cooperation? Like,
no,
what are the actors here?
This is all within Tunisia itself.
Okay, gotcha.
But what about boundaries, right? We talk about boundaries of countries, but there are also boundaries within a country, right? So, yeah.
True. Interesting. Yeah, actually, can you comment on the cultural demographics within Tunisia?
It's religiously, I think, mostly Islamic, but culturally Berber, right? Because it's a Berber culture, and so you have there's a lot of tourism, especially along the coast, as you can imagine, and a fair amount of water, and including surface water, gets diverted towards supporting that economy, because again, it's a huge economy. But then that creates challenges for people in agricultural communities to access water. So again, when you think about boundaries and you think about cooperation, they're just different uses of water, even within the boundaries of a country, that can create tensions, for sharing this resource. So that's part of the landscape of Tunisia as well.
Okay, interesting. How about the climate? Pretty Mediterranean, or does it get much drier desert as well?
Both. So the north is the rainiest, and then there's this transition period, and then the south is where it sort of it starts entering the Sahara, right? So that's where it gets pretty where water is particularly problematic in the
Yeah.
south.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. So your research, were you doing research in Tunisia? Can you kind of, I know you kind of already started getting into what you guys found, but
Yeah. So most of this was, we were working with some clients whom I can't name at the moment, and we were working with some of them in order to help. So this is a major bilateral donor that funds huge development projects in in Africa, including Tunisia, and we were helping them again just to figure out how do you better spend the money you have in order to be able to sort of meet your goal of improving incomes, improving livelihoods, and better managing natural resources so that those livelihoods are supported, right? Because these livelihoods are dependent on the management of these natural resources. So that's kind of what we were doing out there. Fortunately, we've had, most of us who were working on the team at that time had some experience of working in Northern Africa. So, but then the pandemic struck. And then we were committed towards sort of helping this donor figure things out. And so a lot of what we ended up doing was, through our previous understanding of being in those regions, working with locals who were living and, collaborators who were living and working in Tunisia while the pandemic was going on. And then coming up with this set of, what are some of the better practices that could be taken up in order to move this, to make this money to be a bit more effective. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Can you kind of unpack the key findings of that? For like, how can you use water to be more effective and efficient?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, in the case of Tunisia, it's going to be a combination of these. Like I said, there is scope to certainly bring in practices such as drip irrigation, etc. So in order to use, to use water more efficiently. But again, remember, the minute you start using drip, you use water more efficiently, but you also put more land under agricultural production. So you got to be careful about that. And I think the one thing is, how do you revive some of these traditional practices which have been used by communities in order to recharge groundwater, and what can be done as agricultural land and is itself sort of used more intensively. And so coming up with a list of here are some of the practices that have been used, and here's how you could go about deploying them. Again, like I said, everybody in Tunisia, every Tunisian farmer is aware of the fact that their livelihood depends on groundwater, and groundwater is depleting because their energy bills are going up as groundwater keeps getting depleted, right? So everybody's aware of this. So again, how do you reduce the drudgery of all of this? And you can't, and I don't think leaving it to the individual actions of hundreds of thousands of small farmers is necessarily the best way to go about doing this. So it becomes the role of the state, it becomes the role of an agency to say, we are going to manage landscapes better and leave the art of cultivation to the hands of farmers. And that's what gets things done. And so that's kind of what the big recommendation there was. That there are lots of practices that can and should be implemented immediately, but please don't necessarily rely on the ability of hundreds of thousands of small farmers to do this individually on each piece of land. That's not the solution.
Gotcha. Yeah. I am curious how feasible it is, how realistic is that for a government to put into place, like what's the timeline? Well, okay, so I'm curious what the timeline you think would be for Jordan, if you want to go back to Jordan, and then also for Tunisia. Is this another branch of government? Is this something that they can easily create within a branch or a department that they already have? Is this likely to happen even? What do you think?
Ag extension.
Yeah.
The whole
Okay.
problem is, in the last 25 years, agricultural extension has fallen by the wayside in most countries. That needs to come back. It's the same thing that sort of happened at one level with public health, right? public health efforts have kind of fallen by the wayside, and a pandemic had to happen, and then everybody was like, oh my goodness, we have underinvested in public health. That was the realization that's been the big realization from this pandemic, right? That the massive underinvestment in public health and our ability to be able to respond to crisis is really poor. Similar here, agricultural extension, investments in agricultural extension have fallen by the wayside in most low and middle income countries, even high income countries, in the last 20 years. I say this as a scientist here, right? I'm not saying this as an employee of the bank. I'm saying this as a scientist. A government has to do its job.
Yeah.
And there is no substitute for that.
Yeah.
So, and that's what we elect governments for. That's what governments are there for, elected or otherwise, right? That's what they're there for. So it is the role of, and where we see these transitions being supported, we see a very active role of the state. Look at Israel. Look at China, right? So for example, if China wants to, again, groundwater is a huge problem in the North China Plain, and there is this recognition that, they really need to stop or reduce the amount of water that's abstracted. And the only way that they can do it is to really sort of, they've tried all kinds of things, drip irrigation, all of that kind of stuff, but that only gets you so far. And the only thing that you really can do is to just pay farmers to not cultivate and to keep it shallow. But that requires the state to do it. And so as long as the state keeps pumping money and doing it, you can make it happen. So, but then the question then becomes, if you can't keep paying farmers in perpetuity, what do they do? How do you move them out of the farm sector? And that's going to take a while because off-farm sectors have to develop. But until that happens, the state has to be willing to pay that check out and say, we're supporting this transition. So these kinds of changes do not happen without the state coming in to support transitions. It's a vital condition. It's a necessary condition.
Yeah.
It's not a sufficient condition, but it's definitely a necessary condition. Nothing's going to happen without the state getting involved. And so I do think the state needs to get involved here. And it's not that hard because these are agricultural extension practices, that it's there somewhere in institutional memory, but somehow has fallen by the wayside. And it just needs that political commitment towards saying we're doing this, because unless we do this, it's going to be very hard to break some of these or to solve some of these problems. We are going to need support. Public support is needed and money is needed to do it, right? So, and I think if it's done properly and done well, I think it is possible to make these changes that certainly at least push the problem out. I don't know if it'll solve the problem, but it'll push the problem out for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not going to happen without the role of the state. It's not going to happen without the role of the state.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you about Ethiopia as well, but do you have anything else you wanted to say about Tunisia?
No, I'm happy to talk about Ethiopia, right? Very different problem though there, yeah? I mean, when it comes to, again, agricultural water. I mean, the challenge with sub-Saharan Africa is most agriculture is even now rain-fed, right? And so rain-fed agriculture is risky. And with climate change, rain-fed agriculture is becoming riskier. And so one of the big challenges that sub-Saharan African countries are dealing with is how do you improve food security in this landscape, which is so challenging. And irrigated agriculture certainly reduces some of those risks. But the landscape of Africa is very different, right? I mean, just agroclimatically speaking, and looking at things like the density of population, the kinds of whatever we know about irrigation comes from Asia and the Middle East, where there has been a very, very long history of irrigation, right? Including in prehistoric times, the Tigris, the Euphrates, all this water being diverted and all this agricultural land, in Sumerian civilization, all of that stuff, right? So there is a history of irrigated agriculture in these countries. But in sub-Saharan Africa, there isn't. Agriculture has been rain-fed. So again, where you start matters, how you start matters, right? And so sub-Saharan Africa is largely rain-fed even today, and rain-fed agriculture is getting riskier and riskier because of the vagaries of climate change, right? Because it doesn't rain when it's supposed to rain, it doesn't rain in the quantities it's supposed to rain, and then suddenly you have this flash flood that's happening because of so much of intense rainfall, and the crop gets destroyed, right? And so how do you irrigate in sub-Saharan Africa is the big question, and it's not easy because the kinds of investments that were put into place, let's say in Asia, right, will not work in sub-Saharan Africa because the density of populations are different and the crops are different. So one of the things that we've been looking at, but Ethiopia is very keen, has been very keen to increase irrigated agriculture. And so one of the things that Ethiopia has done in the past is they've made it, and there's a number of challenges in doing that. So one is the landscape, the infrastructure, but also costs. Things cost much more and have always cost much more in sub-Saharan Africa because a lot of these technologies are imported from different countries. And then energy costs are much higher, have always been much higher in sub-Saharan Africa. And transport costs are much, much higher. Import duties are there. And so when you bring all of this in, these technologies are quite expensive. So pumps, for example, small gadgets that people can use to pull water out of the ground, right? They're expensive. Most smallholder farms in Ethiopia can't afford to buy these pumps because they are quite expensive. So one of the things that the government had done in the past was remove the import duties on these pumps so that the price of the pump falls in the market. But yet the adoption of these pumps has actually been quite low. So again, we went in to sort of look at what is it, because people keep talking about, people need to buy these pumps. The pumps are expensive. Reduce the price of the pumps. People will buy them. But that's not happened. So what's going on? And so what we realized was that why would a smallholder purchase a pump, an expensive pump, even with the discounted price? It's still quite expensive, right? Why would you purchase this pump if you didn't know where to drill a borehole so that you can install the pump? Borehole drilling in Ethiopia is very risky. So there isn't a lot of good information available on where you drill and how deep you drill in order to be able to hit water.
Interesting.
So very often what happens is farmers drill, they don't hit water, and they've spent a few $1,000s on nothing.
Yeah.
Or you drill, you hit water, but you're in just that part of the aquifer where you have water for about 2 or 3 months, and for the rest of the year there is no water there, right? It's seasonal. So why would you purchase an expensive pump if you don't know what you're going to even get at the end of the day? You don't know where to put this pump because you don't know where to drill. And again, this goes back to extension and public information, right? That's the common theme that's through all of this work. You can encourage a private sector firm to bring good. You can incentivize them and say, we will incentivize you to bring reliable technologies into the country. We will incentivize you to sell these pumps to farmers, right? But unless the farmer doesn't know where to drill a well to install the pump, he's not going to buy the pump. Or she is not going to buy the pump, rather. Let's put it that way. So what we showed through research on the ground was not knowing where to drill the borehole, and the uncertainty around drilling the borehole is the biggest barrier towards purchasing a pump, not the price of the pump.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. And so this again goes back to better extension. How can the government do some really good hydrology, hydrogeology, to map these aquifers, to provide the technical expertise to train borehole drilling companies to not use a hit or miss approach and actually use some scientific knowledge to drill these boreholes to reduce failure?
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to better extension. Technology adoption does not happen when there are asymmetries of information, there are huge uncertainties, and if there's drudgery involved.
Yeah, back to the drudgery.
So unless these three things are addressed, getting people to adopt technologies that are good for them is very, very hard.
Okay. I have to ask, is this at all related to the massive dam that Ethiopia has put in on one of the rivers? The Nile, I forget which one it is. Are they also trying to use some of that water for storage for irrigation, or is that primarily hydropower? Do you know?
So we were looking at groundwater systems. I mean,
Okay.
in that sense, so in that sense, I don't think it's directly related to the issue of the dam and the damming of the river and what might happen downstream. So no. So so that the issue of the dam and the water sharing between sort of Ethiopia and I think it's Egypt, right? That's the big question out there. That's something that we haven't. That's something that we haven't looked into. I mean, this work was with my previous organization.
Right.
Not something that we looked into. So I don't know whether I can even really speak credibly about it.
Right.
I mean, I know what the broad strokes of the issues are, but I haven't looked at it enough to be able to give you an informed opinion on that piece of the story there.
Yeah, for sure. For the listeners, I'll just kind of explain a little bit briefly about what I was talking about. And let us know in the comments on social media or however you can if you want to see an episode on this. It could be pretty interesting. But Ethiopia has started to build, honestly, I don't remember the status. I did a lot of research on this a few years ago, was when I was in undergrad studying geology, actually. But they have this massive dam that they, I believe, have put in, and they're starting to fill it. Now, Egypt is downstream on the Nile River, and they rely on this water for everything. I mean, their cities are being built by the Nile all the whole way down. And you've got, massive irrigation projects that feed the country in the Nile Delta. So basically, they're concerned that they're not going to have enough water. Hopefully I can do an interview and we'll do a podcast episode on this, but that's the introduction to that one.
And I think it's an interesting issue for you to explore further. I mean, like I said, I can't incredibly speak about this particular thing, but a lot of it is going to depend upon just the hydrology, right? Because depending upon the I'm not a hydrologist, but depending upon the hydrological system that you're in, it may or may not have so much of an effect downstream, depending upon where you build the river and what the hydrology of this is, right? And I think, if I remember correctly from some previous discussions, scientifically there's been some debate on what exactly the hydrology of this river is. And does really building this thing upstream affect sort of, water downstream? So at one level, it's a hydrological issue. But at another level, it's also, I mean, just from an intellectual perspective, right? It's an issue of, on the one hand, there's an upstream country that does have the sovereign right to use its resources in the way it wants. But from a transboundary perspective, you have a downstream country that has established its right to use much earlier. And how do those two get resolved? That's really the question here, right?
Right. Yeah, I can't wait to do an episode on this. I honestly, it's on the list. It's on the short list.
I think part of it is going to have to do with, I mean, frankly, finding solutions that are going to work in general, in broad brush strokes, is going to depend upon better information sharing.
Yeah.
Which I think is a constraint at the moment. If I understand where things are at, right? Because different stakeholders are going to have to come together to say, this is what we need this water for, this is what we need this water for, and how do we make sure that we all get this together? So in a sense, it is going to call for better analytics, better data sharing, some amount of reciprocity, etc. But I'll leave it there and let others who understand this better talk about it. But there's a number of interesting questions, ways in which you can pose this problem. Yes. There's a logical issue, but there's also a legal sort of issue, right? In terms of the sovereign right to use a resource versus a riparian right that has been established because you were first in use, or you were earlier in use. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. So we went into the scary cave. We poked the dragon. I'm going to run back out now and go back to Jordan and Tunisia and Ethiopia. I wanted to ask you, and feel free to comment more on Ethiopia and your research and the key findings there. But I did want to ask you specifically with cross-border environmental cooperation in these three countries, what do you see as the potential for collaboration across boundaries, maybe across borders even? Like, is this a necessity? Does this help dramatically? Is it more needed in some areas than others? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I really think there's a big role for technology to play out here, but technology that is contextually appropriate. So how can, brilliant, innovative Israeli companies think about developing technologies in cultural and economic contexts that's not Israel, right? Which is a new market for these companies, but also there is this sense of, social responsibility, etc. Right? I think that's where I see that's where I see the biggest potential for things to move.
Nice.
And in a sense, it appeals to and it's a practical thing that appeals to a number of people on different fronts, right? And so again, you really should talk to Ram Fishman at Tel Aviv about this, because these are some of the things that he's looking at, and he will be able to credit credibly on this. But I will agree with Ram. I think that's where the potential is.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've heard this before. I mean, better technology is always good. Sometimes
technology contextually and culturally appropriate technologies.
Yes.
Right? So in Israel, it may make perfect sense to have drip irrigation systems which are like 95% efficient, right? Maybe in Ethiopia, what you need is something is 65%, but it's better than what it is right now, right? Because 65% would be just too expensive, would not work agroclimatically. So how do you then understand the cultural context in which you're working in, and then bring in appropriate technologies? So I'll give you an example of this. This is beyond the Middle East, but I think this is important. Cook stoves, clean cook stoves, right? So people come up with electric cook stoves, etc., right? Because hey, these are cleaner. Why would you not want to use them? You don't have to burn firewood and cow dung and have all kinds of indoor air pollution and respiratory problems, etc. One of the biggest reasons, and this is something that we're looking into in other contexts. We're looking at this in South Asia, but I think this example is relevant. One of the things that's emerging from anecdotal stories that we're hearing is that the reason why so people purchase these electric stoves, or very often they're given to poor communities at a highly subsidized price, and yet people who own them don't use them. Why? Because, again, many of these cooked stoves take much longer to cook a particular dish than it would if you used fuel. So again, it goes back to time.
Yeah.
So if I am a woman and I cook for a family of 10, right? If I have to double the time it takes me to make a meal, I'm not going to be happy using this. I'd rather breathe some more, smoky air. Anyway, I'm going to die no matter what. I'll just die a little earlier. So you see, again, it goes back to drudgery and time. And so this is what I mean when I say we have to think of contextually appropriate technologies.
Yeah, that's good.
Right? And so there are dishes that are prepared in cultures where it cooks best when heat comes. There's got to be high levels of heat coming from all sides, shaped in a wok. The minute it becomes something which is electric, it's flat. You can't put a wok on it. It has to be a flat bottom dish that you cook in. And then the heat is such that the whole process of cooking. So the way this apparatus works is such that the whole process of cooking a meal becomes much longer than what it normally is. So it is these kinds of things which break technology adoption. And I genuinely think we don't understand this well enough. So to all those brilliant innovators in Israel, I would say, get out there and just go back to your backpacking days. Go out there and go spend some time in the world. If there's a problem that you're interested in, go see how people in Ethiopia or India or Nepal or wherever you're interested in, how do they go about living their life, which will give you ideas for how do you have truly transformative technology.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't think we understand this enough, because most innovation comes from the West. That's the whole problem.
Yeah.
Innovation comes from OECD countries. But how do you innovate it in a way that's appropriate for use beyond these contexts is really the question.
Yeah.
Or so, how do you work with local companies? How might Israeli companies work with companies in Ethiopia, India, wherever you are, to understand that perspective that then informs innovation? That's partnership. That's true partnership.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to kind of try to pull together two big themes for folks here. What I'm hearing is that we need, the communities in Middle East, North Africa, need culturally appropriate technologies that work for them, for their area, for their needs, on their scales, for communities, small-scale farms, large-scale farms, whatever it is, and for families, right, that have a profit to make, that are relying on these things. So we need the technology, the right technology. And then with that, we have to have some level of government support for implementation to, as you say, kind of minimize the drudgery and the work and the time to install and teach folks about these technologies and help them get there in the transition. And when we have both of these things, we're going to be doing a lot better with sustainability.
Yeah, I think we will push the problem out. So I think what needs to be done is it's not the next big idea as much as thinking about drudgery, time, thinking about how do you reduce those costs. And really, I do think you need this. I do believe the state has a very important role to play in terms of pulling all of this together and being the ringmaster, so to speak.
Yeah. Wow, good stuff. We're winding down towards the end of the interview. I did want to ask you about COP27, which is the UN Climate Change Conference. Can you talk about the challenges of easing barriers in terms of your role with the World Bank, from your personal opinion, of course, because that's what you can get.
Right. I mean, a lot of COP this time is really going to be about implementation, right? So it's about the pledges that were made in the past, and now there's the implementation of it. But the implementation of it has to be just. It has to be equitable. It has to make sense, right? And I think that's what this whole conversation is going to be. And I think what's truly needed, I feel, is really to understand the perspectives of, you have to understand the problem from the perspective of a low, middle, and a high-income country. But even within each of these countries, like I said, it's not just countries. There are many poor people in the US, and there are many rich people in India, right? And they're not the same, right? So I think being able to understand the heterogeneity of what we're dealing with is going to be extremely important. I feel like the only way this is going to happen at the end of the day is if people, countries essentially sort of say, yes, we're going to do this, and there's going to be a transition. And in that transition, people in our countries, there will be some contingents in our countries that have to struggle. How are we going to ease their struggles, right? Or else we can't get this done.
Right.
So it's going to be, there are always people who will lose from something changing. And understanding what those losses are and how can you stem those losses. That's universal. It doesn't matter what country you're in, but that I think is the thinking that has to go into this. And I think, in a sense, that really is what the COP is for, right? It is to have those tough conversations that says, yeah, we may want to cut carbons, but the fact of the matter is I have 500 million people in poverty as a country. How do I deal with that if we're going to end up transitioning away from carbon, right? Well, how do we get our people out of poverty? What's the solution there? And I think it's those kinds of conversations that have to happen. And it's those barriers that have to be eased. And I think there are things that we can do better than what we are, but there are still these big questions, I think, that need to be answered.
Yeah. By the way, actually, I just wanted to ask, did you happen to get a pass to COP27? Is that somewhere you're going to be in November?
I'm not going to be there in COP27. My bosses are going to be there, but not me.
Yeah. Okay. Right on.
And I think there is recognition about this at the bank. I think the bank is very clear about the fact that there is a global mission to reduce poverty. And it's getting harder and harder to do because of climate change and natural resource degradation. And so how do you balance these? How do you end up doing justice to both is really the question. And I think in general, my personal opinion here from being in this system for the last 7 or 8 months is I think it is a dilemma that people are conscious of. I think it is a hard thing to do. And it's not, this is the challenge of our time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Challenge of our time. I'm wondering, kind of the last question here, what is your advice for people working on these issues? Maybe it's cross-border, cross-boundary environmental cooperation. Maybe it's like international development around sustainability, agriculture, water. But for the people trying to tackle these issues, do you have any pieces of advice that you want to share for the mindset they need or the community focus? I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what's your advice?
I would say understand failure. Why things fail.
Wow. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think what works can often be context specific, but why things fail are fairly universal. So what are we getting from these stories, right? Why do these things fail? It's hard. It's drudgery. It's laborious. That's why people don't want to do it.
Right.
So understand failure. Study failure, understand failure, and then what does that tell you in terms of where you need to go? I think there's a lot of power towards understanding failure, and that's what I would encourage people to do. And also, I think in general, just understanding heterogeneity better, right? Any decision that's made, even within a family, when a decision is made, that decision has different implications for different members of the family. So cities are like that, countries are like that, the world is like that. There is a lot of heterogeneity in how we live our lives. And it's not just about, religion and race. And yes, those are the obvious ones. But it's also the nitty-gritties of how we live our life, what we have access to, what we can even aspire to. And the more we understand that, the more we realized how globally often ill-prepared we are to sort of accommodate the needs of different people. How do you create policy which is able to at the risk of sounding very macabre, how do you create policy that does least harm?
Yeah.
Right? Which is again the same as why do things fail, right? So I will say, I think what's required, everybody kind of thinks about what works. And so there's a tendency to sort of say, oh, this worked in this place. And you start extrapolating because it worked in one place. And then you try it elsewhere. And then there's like, oh my God, this didn't work. Right? So I would actually flip it around and say, why do things fail?
That's good.
And how do we think about, if we were to do this, who is likely to be affected badly by this change? Not what is the good stuff that's likely to happen, but who is likely to be affected by this change? And what do we need to do in order to make this up to them or bring them along?
Yeah, that's really good.
I mean, it's the same in a company, right? If HR makes a change, there will be people who will be very unhappy with that change. So if you want to sort of have that change go through, you have to bring those people along with you and say, this is what we're going to do to offset the fact that this is going to affect you badly. The same works in government, the same works at any level of decision making. You have to start thinking about who is it going to detrimentally affect, because somebody will be. Somebody is not going to be pleased about this because it has consequences for them. How do we understand that, identify that, and make sure that that gets addressed mainstream?
Amazing. Well, Soumya, this conversation has been really rich, honestly, way better than I imagined.
Much longer than either of us thought it would be. So
yeah, definitely that too. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the research you're doing and your advice. It's been really good. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.
All right. Well, yeah, that was part B of this two-part conversation. Thanks for listening through. I hope it was meaningful. I hope you learned something. I hope it was memorable. I know I learned a ton, and it was super informative about a range of geographies and conflicts. I want to invite you to join the conversation on social media if you haven't done so already. You can find us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, whatever works best for you. And that's a great way to connect with me as the host, and also to connect with other listeners who want to engage with the content and learn more. If you don't know, we are on YouTube, and you can watch the videos instead of just the audio if you want to do that, so check it out. I want to invite you to leave a review. And why? Why do reviews matter? So reviews help more listeners find this show. So if this is, the kind of information that you want more people to learn about, right? If you like the show, I would invite you to leave a review so more people can find it. That would be super helpful. If this is the kind of content that you want to hear more of, I would invite you to maybe even consider supporting the show financially. We have a Patreon website, which I'll link down below. And if you do that, it's just basically pledging a few dollars per month, whatever works for you. And there's a few different tiers where you can give. If you do that, you do get access to some exclusive content and unique opportunities that the rest of the folks don't get. So check that out if it's interesting to you, link down below. So yeah, that's a wrap for today. I'm your host, Josiah Shaver. I also did the editing and publishing for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Till then, grace and peace to you and yours.